In 1972, Bobby Fischer won the World Chess Championship, the title he'd wanted since he was a teenager sleeping next to a chessboard. 3 years later, with that title still legally his, with a challenger already picked, with the entire chess world waiting, Fischer refused to play a single game to keep it. Nobody beat him. He simply let it go. He set a list of conditions the Federation wouldn't accept, and when they said no, he walked. The most dominant chess player alive gave up his crown without anyone laying a hand on it. That's strange enough on its own. What's stranger is how often it happens to people who will never be famous for it. Someone spends 2 years building a company toward an acquisition offer and picks a fight over a clause that doesn't actually matter 3 days before signing. Someone trains for a decade for one qualifying race and does something reckless with their body the week before trials that they'd never risk the rest of the year. Someone finally gets the good audition, the one they always said they wanted, and shows up unprepared, for reasons they can't explain to themselves afterward. Ask any of them later and they describe it the same way. Something came over me. I don't know what happened. It's like a different person made that decision. The obvious explanation is fear of losing. Getting close to something you want is terrifying, the theory goes, because now there's something real to lose. So people flinch and pull back to protect themselves from the pain of coming up short in the end. It's a tidy story. It falls apart the moment you look at the actual case. Fischer wasn't afraid of losing to Karpov. By every measure available at the time, he was still considered the strongest player alive, and most of the chess world expected him to win comfortably if the match had gone ahead. This wasn't a man bracing for a defeat he saw coming. His results, his preparation, his reputation, none of it pointed to someone worried about being outplayed. The same gap shows up in the smaller version of the story. The founder who blows up the acquisition usually isn't the founder who secretly doubts the product. Often it's the opposite. They're more confident in the deal than anyone else in the room, right up until the moment they torch it. If this were simple fear of losing, sabotage would hit the people with the shakiest odds hardest. Instead, it tends to land on people who are winning clearly enough that failure wasn't really on the table until they put it there themselves. Fear of losing explains why an underdog might hesitate. It doesn't explain why a favorite would walk away from a fight nobody thought he could lose. There's a smaller detail that makes the fear of losing story even harder to hold on to. In the years leading up to the default, Fischer kept insisting, publicly and privately, that he was still the best player alive, not doubting it, defending it, sometimes to people who hadn't even questioned it. That's not the posture of someone quietly unsure whether he could still win. It is the posture of someone so certain of the answer that the actual test had become almost beside the point. You don't need to play the game to prove you're the best, if some part of you has already decided the game was never really where the proof lived. So maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe Fischer was just difficult, arrogant, demanding, the kind of man who needed everything on his own terms, or not at all, and this was one more tantrum in a career full of them. That version has more evidence behind it on the surface. Fischer was famous for outrageous demands before matches. About lighting, about cameras, about prize money, about the exact shape of the chairs, as if the outcome of the World Championship hinged on lumbar support. He'd walked out of tournaments before over conditions far smaller than a world title. It's tempting to file 1975 under the same heading. Another Fischer meltdown. Nothing deeper to it. But look closely at what he actually demanded that year, and just difficult stops explaining anything. He didn't ask for terms that would make it easier to win. He asked for a match with no game limit, played to 10 wins, where a 9-9 tie would let him keep the title without needing an outright win at all. On paper, those are the terms of someone protecting himself from ever losing outright. A match that could run for months. Structured so the only way to actually take the crown from him was to beat him decisively, not once, but by 2 clear games. That isn't the ego of a man who wants a fair fight and can't stand to lose it. It's someone quietly engineering conditions under which losing becomes almost impossible to prove. Which raises the real question. If he wasn't scared of losing and this wasn't ego for its own sake, what was he actually protecting? The clue isn't in the demands, it's in what he did the moment he'd already won. After Reykjavik, Fischer didn't do any of the things a new champion is supposed to do. He didn't play exhibitions, he didn't sign the endorsement deals worth millions that were sitting on the table waiting for a signature. He didn't defend the title in smaller events to stay sharp. He essentially disappeared, moving between hotel rooms in Los Angeles, cutting off most of the chess world, playing almost no competitive chess at all for the next 3 years. The most dangerous player on Earth, at the exact moment he had the leverage and the fame to do anything he wanted with it, chose to do nothing with it. People close to him at the time described someone who seemed less relieved by the win than unsettled by it. Before Reykjavik, every day had the same shape. Study, prepare, close the gap with the champion. After Reykjavik, that shape was gone. There was no longer a version of Bobby Fischer who was still becoming the best player in the world. There was only a version who already was one, with nowhere left to go but down. Here's the first real layer of it. Winning doesn't just end the pursuit. It ends the story where you're still becoming something. As long as Fischer hadn't defended the title, there was a version of events where he was still the prodigy closing in on greatness, unproven, untested, but full of a potential nobody could argue with. The moment he sat down and defended it, that story was over. From then on, every game wouldn't be a step toward the top. It would be a referendum on whether he still belonged there. He could only confirm what he already was, or start proving he wasn't it anymore. That's not fear of losing one match. It's fear of trading an open story for a closed one. Before you've won, the ceiling is imaginary and can be anything. After you've won, the ceiling is real, and it's the only direction left. And it isn't only a story he was telling himself, it's a story other people were telling about him too, and it was a better one before he won. As the challenger closing in on the Soviet chess machine, Fischer was the underdog a whole country had adopted, cheered for, forgiven his outbursts, given the benefit of every doubt, because he was still technically the guy who might not make it. A champion doesn't get adopted like that. A champion gets audited. The same public that rooted for him unconditionally on the way up would spend the rest of his career comparing every move to the one that already happened. You can find a smaller version of this almost anywhere that isn't chess. The employee who's finally up for the promotion they wanted for years and quietly stops doing the extra work that got them there. Not because they don't want it anymore, but because as a candidate they were still improving. As the person who got it, there's nowhere left to point except at whether they deserve to keep it, or the person who's been about to propose for 6 years. Ring already bought, sitting in a drawer they open sometimes just to look at it, because a drawer with a ring in it is a beautiful, ongoing story, and a hand with a ring on it is just an answer waiting to be tested. Take Daniel, a version of this that plays out in a much smaller room than a chessboard watched by the world. Daniel spent 2 years building a small software company around one product that actually worked. A tool used by maybe 40,000 people, growing slowly, funded on savings and a shrinking amount of patience from his wife. A larger company made an offer. Not a fortune, but enough to change his life, enough to pay off the house. Enough that he could tell people correctly that the thing he built from nothing was worth something to somebody else. The deal moved fast. 3 weeks of calls, lawyers, term sheets. Everyone on both sides wanted it to happen. 2 days before signing, on a call that was supposed to take 15 minutes and confirm the last few details, Daniel stopped the conversation over a clause about who'd own the product name for 6 months after the acquisition. It was a formality. The buyer's lawyer said as much, twice, in the calm, slightly bored voice of someone who has said this exact sentence in dozens of other deals. Daniel's own lawyer had told him in writing, before the call even started, that the clause changed nothing, since he had no plans to start a competing company anyway. He knew that. He kept going. His voice got louder over a point nobody else in the room thought was a point at all, and when the call ended without resolution, he stayed up and wrote an email at 1 a.m. that used the word principal 4 times, which is roughly 3 times more than any email about a licensing clause needs to. By the end of the week, the buyer had walked. Ask Daniel today why he did it, and he'll give you an answer about fairness, about not being pushed around, about standing his ground. Watch his face while he says it, though, and there's a half-second where the story doesn't quite land. The same half-second you'd expect from someone repeating an explanation they've told themselves so many times. It now sounds true, even to him. Here's a detail Daniel doesn't bring up on his own, but confirms if you ask him directly. While the deal was still open, people who barely knew him kept texting to ask how it was going, offering advice, wanting updates, treating him like a guy on his way somewhere. In the weeks after it fell apart, almost none of them asked about the company again. Not out of judgment, just because there was nothing left to root for. He noticed. He says it didn't bother him. It's worth noticing that he brought it up unprompted anyway. What actually happened is closer to this. The moment the deal was 2 days from closing, Daniel stopped being the founder who might make it and started facing the prospect of being the guy who sold his company for a number some people would quietly consider small. Before the deal, the story had no ceiling. He could still be the next huge thing. After the deal, there'd be a number attached to what he'd built, permanent and public, almost certainly smaller than what he'd secretly hoped for. Blowing it up over a clause that didn't matter let him keep the bigger, unfinished version of the story instead. Here's where it gets uncomfortable, because that explanation, protecting the open story instead of accepting the closed one, sounds complete. It isn't. Go back to Fischer's 3 empty years after Reykjavik. If the mechanism were only about avoiding a fixed verdict, you'd expect him to still be doing something with the time. Writing, coaching, building the next chapter of Still Becoming, just aimed somewhere other than a title defense. Instead, he did almost nothing. He wasn't managing a transition from becoming to being. He was avoiding it entirely, in every direction, not just the one direction of an actual match. Which points to something underneath the fear of a closed story. For men like Fischer and for men like Daniel, the pursuit was never the price paid on the way to the goal. The pursuit was the entire reason there was a self worth talking about in the first place. Take away the climb, and it isn't that the story gets worse. It's that there's no longer a story that requires him at all. Anyone can hold a title once it's been handed to them. Only he could be the person still fighting to take it. The becoming wasn't protecting a better ending. The becoming was the only place he existed as someone specific, instead of someone finished. Look at Daniel again with that in mind, and the clause stops being the whole explanation. He didn't only avoid a smaller number attached to his company. In the weeks after the deal fell through, he didn't pivot to a bigger vision, didn't raise the next round, didn't go build something worth more. He mostly just kept the company running exactly where it was, at exactly the size it had been the day the offer came in. Busy, but not moving. If the fight had really been about protecting a shot at something bigger, the months afterward would have been spent chasing that something bigger. They weren't. What he protected wasn't a better future. It was the specific, familiar version of himself who was still in the middle of trying. A person he apparently knew how to be far better than he knew how to be someone who'd already arrived. That's the piece the first explanation missed. It isn't that winning shrinks a good story into a smaller one. It's that winning removes the only role the person ever actually knew how to play, and the only role other people were ever going to root for, without asking anything of him in return. So the full shape of it looks like this. Somewhere early on, usually without choosing it consciously, a person builds their sense of who they are around the act of reaching, not around anything they'd actually have once they got there. Reaching gives them a self with unlimited room to grow into. Arriving gives them a self with a fixed, checkable outline, one that can be measured, compared, and eventually found wanting. So when the finish line finally arrives, some quiet, older part of them doesn't experience it as a reward. It experiences it as an eviction. The price isn't subtle, and it isn't paid once. Fischer spent most of the next 2 decades outside competitive chess entirely, and eventually left the country that made him, estranged from nearly everyone who'd known him at his best. Daniel is still telling people the story about the clause that mattered 3 years later, running a smaller company that never grew again the way it had in the 2 years before the deal that didn't happen. Neither of them lost by trying and coming up short. They lost by making sure the test never finished, which means neither of them will ever know what would have happened if it had. And that's the part worth sitting with. Somewhere in your own life, right now, there's probably something you've been reaching for long enough that the reaching itself has started to feel like who you are. A version of a job, a relationship, a body of work. A version of yourself you've been about to become for longer than feels comfortable to say out loud. So here's the question Fischer never got to answer, 3 years away from a board he refused to sit down at. If you actually got the thing tomorrow, all of it, no more excuses, no more almost, who would you be the day after, once no one has to root for you anymore?